Thank you. Thank you for asking me. Can you all hear me by speaking into the microphone in the right way? Right. So we should be very clear exactly what we're discussing. Firstly, with regard to what's meant by God, I take God to mean an omniperfect being who is the creator of all things. So I'm thinking of God roughly in the spirit of the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. Now, what we are being asked to discuss, and this is very important, is not whether or not such a God exists. And I know it's perhaps just a form of shorthand, talking about the atheist side and the theist side doesn't seem to be right at all. What we're being asked about is whether or not there is a rational proof of the existence of God. And it's against that I wish to argue. With regard to the existence of God and to be open, I think that probably, but it's only a probable thing, no such being exists. But I think, in a way it's a pity that one doesn't have on our side, arguing against there being a rational proof, somebody who is a genuine theist and believes that God exists. Because believing that God exists, holding that it is the case that God exists, is a completely different matter from saying that there is a rational proof of God's existence. Now, there is some ambiguity about how that question, which we will answer, is itself to be understood. One way of taking it, the most obvious way of taking it, is we're being asked, can somebody produce such a proof? Has such a proof been found? And if it's like that, then we should think of it as a sort of factual question about whether or not there is such a proof. It's a factual, supposing one asked, is there somebody who's 150 years old? Or supposing one asked about some point of mathematics, has a proof been found for it? What you do is to go to the experts. So you would, with regard to a 150-year-old, you'd have to look around doctors and to prove that there really was somebody who was 150-year-old, you would have to produce somebody where there was good evidence that they were of that age, evidence which was accepted by experts. The same with regard to our mathematical proof. It wouldn't be just finding one or two mathematicians who said, yes, this has been proven. It would be that among the people who were the experts, among the good mathematicians, there was a consensus about this. With regard to rational proof of the existence of God, among most of the people who are the experts, whether or not they think that God exists, whether or not they're religious believers, and probably most of the people who are experts in this are religious believers, but the general view today is that there is no rational proof of the existence of God. Now, one has to qualify, or has to make clear here what's meant by a proof. Of course, if you think that a proof is some argument which moves in a valid way from some set of premises to the conclusion God exists, yes, there are a lot of such arguments which are valid arguments. The trouble is that the premises are ones that nobody who rejects the existence of God when they start out would accept them. So here one's talking about a proof which moves from premises which anybody would feel compelled to accept by logical steps to the conclusion that God exists. You might, however, say that in taking the question for debate in that way, I've made it too easy for myself. That we're not asking about whether somebody has yet found a proof of the existence of God, but whether one is findable in principle. And that is much more difficult for me. Of course, if God doesn't exist, there can't be a rational proof for his existence. There can't be a rational proof of something which is false. But I certainly don't think that I can show that God doesn't exist. Indeed, it might well be the case that it does. Nonetheless, I think even taking it in this way, there are reasonable grounds for saying that it's extremely unlikely that anybody will in the future be able to devise a rational proof of the existence of God. I mean, let's look at the history of this. In the ancient world, in the Middle Ages, and in the 17th century, there were current a number of sort of metaphysical proofs of the existence of God, which started from very simple premises and led by more or less complex arguments to the conclusion God exists. And a number of these were generally accepted by very clever people at the time. Nowadays, very few philosophers would accept these arguments. In a few cases, it's because they've seen there's actually a fault in the argument, there's a slip, the argument's invalid. In most cases, it's not that. In most cases, what we see now is that in these arguments there are premises which covertly contain ideas about God. These premises seemed, in the 17th century and earlier, absolutely obvious. Everybody accepted them. They accepted them because they lived in a world which was so deeply informed by belief in God. But now we see them for what they are. They're premises in which the conclusion already lurks. And so we tend not to accept any of these old-fashioned metaphysical arguments. People then move to a stage when the most compelling argument for the existence of God seemed to be the order and design which is found in the universe, which seemed to be the result of an intelligent designer. But not only are there philosophical grounds on which one might doubt the logic of such an argument, I mean, much more seriously, the theory of evolution does give us a much more straightforward way to explain this appearance of design. Of course, the theory of evolution does not mean that it's impossible that there is an intelligent designer, but it means that one can't use the fact of there being this appearance of design to argue for the existence of God. So it seems that we've run to the end of these big arguments for the existence of God. But you might say, all right, but perhaps we can put together an argument for the existence of God from lots of little pieces of evidence, all of which add up together to convincing us that at least it's much more probable God exists than not. But here, I think, we face a big problem because of what are called atheological arguments. Atheological arguments are arguments which come from either some feature of God's attributes, or else from some feature of the world, as a result of which it seems that God does not exist. The most powerful, the most obvious example of them is the argument from evil. Is the amount of evil that there is in the universe compatible with the existence of an omnipotent, omniperfect, loving God? Now, I think there's no atheological argument which cannot be perfectly satisfactorily rejected by somebody who approaches it from within a belief in God. So if you start off by saying, either I'm convinced by some rational demonstration, or I believe in God as a result of faith, I think you're then in a position to defeat these arguments. But we're talking about constructing an argument from this bit of evidence and that bit of evidence. If so, you need to take into account all the evidence, not just the evidence for God, but this very, very strong evidence against. So, to sum up, what I would like to say is that I can't really see why anybody should want to vote in favour of the motion that there is a rational proof of God's existence. If we would be probably divided into people who think that God exists and people who think that God doesn't. If you don't think God exists, you presumably don't think there's a rational proof of his existence. But even if you do, there's no reason to think there's a rational proof of God's existence. That doesn't mean that you can't accept that God exists, though there's no rational proof.